Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Accounting History Special Interest Group virtual workshop. It's part of our winter series, but it's an early one this year, so it's the December one. Normally we do January, February, and March, but we have an extra one this year, all about archives. So and we are absolutely delighted to have a mix of presenters here today. So firstly, we have Dr. Sean Cunningham, who is Head of Medieval Records in the Collections, Expertise and Engagement Department of the National Archives. And he's going to talk to us today about some of the archives, and he's also been co-I on a project digitising the account books of the treasurer of the Tudor King's Chamber from 1487 to 1521. And he's going to tell us about some of the financial processes and links to the Exchequer, including the teller's notebooks. And he is accompanied by his colleague. I'm going to do all the introductions up front, and then I will let you have the floor so you can swap backwards and forwards between you. His colleague, Dr. Paul Dryburgh, who is one of the principal record specialists in the medieval team at the National Archives, and who's running part of the virtual record treasury of Ireland, so on the medieval Irish Exchequer in Dublin, and how its process is linked to the Westminster government. So they're going to do a double-hander telling us all about those National Archives treasures that relate to accounting. So over to you, Sean, and thank you so much, both of you, for being here today.
Well, I think Paul's going to go first, just because he's dealing with the earlier stuff and I'm kind of going into the Tudor period a little bit. So it'll make more sense to have the Exchequer first.
Sure. We're in the same room. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, we're obviously using Sean's thing. Let me share my screen. If you can tell me when it's ready, Sean.
Sure. We can see it, but it's still in. Oh. That's it. It's good. Good now.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for having us. I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of the medieval Irish Exchequer and then talk a little bit about the project that we've been working on for 10 years nearly now. It's called the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, but we'll come to that sort of in the second half. So there was an Exchequer in Ireland modelled on the English Westminster version from around 1200. So King John, having been made Lord of Ireland in around 1185 following his father's invasion, and then a gradual sort of piecemeal conquest, conflict, the expansion of what we've come to know as a colony, an English colony in Ireland. Sort of those sort of pillars of government, the Exchequer, and then later the Chancery, were founded in Dublin, sort of in the early 13th century. In our early days, it was kind of an independent organisation. Obviously, nominally, it's under the lordship of the English king, but there's a lot of independence that Irish officials and treasurers have. That changes later, and that explains why we have some of the archive here at the National Archives. Here you can see on screen, so this is a brilliant image which was sadly destroyed in 1922, which I'll come to later. And it's kind of one of the few surviving images of a medieval exchequer in practice. So this is the Irish Exchequer Red Book from the reign of Henry VI in the 15th century. And you can kind of see on screen here, this chap with his back to us, this is the accounting official, and this guy I think is the sheriff. He's come in and he's having his account audited. And the chaps around the table are all sort of the chamberlains and the people who are challenging the account, and they're going through it piece by piece. On the table you can see there's like a purse or a sort of a bag with writs in it. There are some counters there. On the checkerboard, the exchequer cloth, again model on the English version. And then sort of at the back here, you've got clerks who are writing both rolls and receipts. And these are sort of, in cartoon form, so to speak, what we're going to talk about in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So we can come back to this image if you like, but this is kind of one of the few surviving images of government in action in Ireland in the medieval period. So like in England, the Irish Exchequer in Dublin kind of had sort of three main functions. There is the upper exchequer, which is the audit function, which audits all of the accounts of the various officials of the crown across the lordship. There's the receipt side of it, which receives monies in and pays monies out. And then there's the legal side. Their event, like as in England, the court develops and its sort of equity jurisdiction develops from that under the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, in terms of records, each of the different parts produces different kinds of records. So the main one, there are more here than I put on the slide, but the main ones are for the upper exchequer, so the Exchequer of Audit. The main ones are the pipe rolls. These are the final audited accounts of royal revenues, county by county or official by official, produced on an annual basis. And you can see on the right here, this is an image from, well, the round room, the old round room, the old Public Record Office in London. This is actually an English pipe roll, but you can kind of see their scale. They're absolutely massive. They're sort of two large sheets of parchment sewn to each other in the middle, and then everything, all of the different sheets are sewn at the top, sort of flip chart style, as Exchequer style. Now this A-frame, I think we've still got some in our basement here, but this is how you would know. We no longer allow researchers to access pipe rolls like this. But you can see this is Mabel Mills, one of the great, the grande dame of Exchequer history. She's here looking in the 1920s at a pipe roll. Sadly for Ireland, while for England, there's an almost unbroken sequence from the 1150s, almost unbroken, to the 1830s. For Ireland, none survived because of the cataclysmic fire and explosion, which I'll come to shortly, in 1922. Beyond that, for the upper exchequer, as the accountants were having their accounts audited, notes were made, or in this case, memoranda. And they were sort of arranged section by section according to the different type of transaction. And I'll come to what those different type of transactions were. Again, these are huge records. They were sort of compiled as the audit was going on, and then sort of rolled up at the end of the year. Sadly, only 2 survive. And those are the rolls for 1309-10 and 1319-20 in the original, but there are others which survive in transcript version. And across the part of the job of the virtual record treasury has been to bring those transcripts together. Now, in terms of the lower exchequer, that's where your officials come in. They come in with their monies, their tallies, their writs. It's where they start the accounting process. And as receipts were received, the lower exchequer created what are called receipt rolls. So these are chronologically arranged record of monies received into the exchequer. Sometimes it's in kind, the Irish exchequer. There's some great payments of, well, it's a bit gruesome, decapitated heads of Irish chieftains. So in the 14th century, there's a thing called head money, which is a bit of a gruesome remnant in the record. So it's not just money that comes in. And then on the flip side of that, you've got issue rolls, which are the chronologically arranged record of monies being paid out at the exchequer, and there are a vast array of supplementary documents required as the accounting process went on. So sort of writs, original orders by the Crown or by officials for payments to be made or allowances to be made, receipts, bills, etc., that kind of thing. These are much smaller in format, but they survive in much greater number due to the colonial archiving process. So, in sort of the late 13th century, Edward I, the great sort of law-making English king, he is made aware of financial accounting scandals at the Dublin Exchequer. Several treasurers who are leading churchmen, archbishops, bishops, they're basically hauled in front of the Westminster Exchequer on charges of corruption. And out of that, from 1293, every treasurer then has to account, every treasurer of the Dublin Exchequer has to account at the Westminster Exchequer. So each of the receipt rolls, you can see here, one example here, is produced in triplicate, one for the treasurer and one each for the 2 chamberlains of the Dublin Exchequer. And in theory, 2 of those were sent over periodically to be audited by the English Exchequer, and one, in theory, was then supposed to be returned to Dublin. Fortunately for us, and for medieval Irish historians, Westminster, though accidents of history happened, Westminster has been a much safer repository for records of Irish administration than Dublin unfortunately turned out to be. And they've survived in much greater number here in our collections, in our E101 series. So here is just an example. This is a page from the Virtual Record Treasury website. You've got some AAAF images of the original rolls, and you kind of see how they're structured. This time they're not flip chart style. They're what's called chancery style. So each of the membranes is sewn at the head and the foot, and then rolled up a bit like a toilet roll. Obviously, you don't tear the sheets off. And it's arranged chronologically. You can see here, on the right-hand side, where's my cursor there? That is the day, that's the feast day. I think that says Tuesday on the morrow of Michaelmas. So that's the 30th of September. And then it moves on. That's Wednesday, there'll be Thursday. And then each of the different days has a variety of different payments coming in. Each of these sort of single line is a payment. And this here is the county, or in this case, the Liberty of Trim. This is Drogheda on the part of Uriel, Drogheda and Meath. And each of these different lines represents a payment made to a royal official, which has then been deposited in the Exchequer. They're often grouped together because actually these sometimes represent sort of tallies that were given out. So the wooden stick that was split in half with the name of the accountant written on it and the amount. So we're not necessarily always getting every payment. Sometimes they group the payments together in one, but sometimes they split them out like this. You can actually see, men and actually women of relatively low social level engaging with royal government in Ireland on a daily basis. And then here at the bottom, you have the sum, in this case, £22, 12 shillings and fourpence. So in the late sort of 13th century, the Irish Exchequer is actually pretty buoyant. It's producing £7,000 a year, which is a vast sum. Obviously the English Exchequer is producing maybe 30,000. So it's not massively far behind considering the size of the population and the difficulties in that not all of the island of Ireland recognises and can contribute to English royal government. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples for time's sake. So this is the memoranda roll. This is one of the two survivors. This is its charred look. It has survived, but it's a bit charred. That's how it would have been rolled up initially, so you can kind of see the format rolled. But since then, the National Archives Ireland, which is the archive which holds those, they've actually conserved them and they've flattened out all of the membranes and the rochelates so that they look sort of now they're flat sheets within a plastic sleeve. So each of the membranes here was sort of laced. There are these three holes at the top where your sort of laces were sewn through, and they were each one was connected to the other by these lacing holes. Above the lacing hole, which wouldn't have been visible when they were rolled up, this is a little sort of note here to tell you what section you're in and which roll of that section you're in. Can't actually read that from here well enough. My eyesight's not good enough. I should have prepared that one, sorry. And then here you can see each of the different entries, which is relevant to as they're processing the account. Now, some of these are just transcripts of different writs or receipts. Some of them are sort of process documents. And as you go through them, you'll see the hand changes so that a clerk has come in afterwards and annotated something that's happened in the process, whether that be, for example, two people have made an agreement or a recognizance, a bond for debt between them, and it's recorded initially in one term, and then at a subsequent date, one of the debtor has paid the debt off, and then somebody comes in and annuls it, and cancels it, crosses it out. So there's quite a lot of process notes in these documents too. But just to give you in sort of tabular form, this is kind of how a memorandum, an Irish memorandum roll is laid out. English memorandums are slightly different. They're slightly more structured. They're slightly more sections. But each of the counties, each of the sheriffs of each of the different counties makes a proffer twice a year. There are writs that come in from England, but also the Irish Chancery. There are sections for recognizances. That's quite a big section for debt. There are sort of a variety of other writs. There are royal summons that go out to officials in the shires to raise debts or to bring debtors into the Exchequer Court to have them prosecuted for whatever it might be. And the variety at this stage, there has been a lot of Italian merchant activity in Ireland as well as in England, and there's still a long tail of debts due to the Riccardi of Lucca, who were granted the customs in England and Ireland. And so there's still an awful lot of dealing with that, even 35, 40 years later, they're still dealing with the backwash of these vast amounts of money that were owed to the Italian merchants. And just to give you a sense of what you're looking at, this is a proffers section. So each of these, this says Vice Comites. So these are all the sheriffs of the variety of the different counties. This then tells you the name of the sheriff and what he's proffered. So this says Geoffrey de Barnwood, Sheriff of Dublin, proffers from the debts of diverse people, £10. These are all written in Latin, I should have said. You do occasionally get documents that are transcribed from the original French. So it's not simply Latin. And then here you can see process notes down here to do with individuals who have not, this is John Disdain, Sheriff of Waterford, has not produced anything. He hasn't returned the writ, so he's actually been immersed. But then later, it says, on the third day, he turns up and he actually gets, he makes his proffer and he gets his immersement cancelled. And you can see it's been cancelled there in the margin. Oops, sorry. And here's just a couple of examples of, writs that come in from the English Chancery. This is something, that they send in a complaint's been made by the Abbot of Holy Cross, and it's to do with certain lands. And so the writ from England is that the Exchequer officials in Dublin to scrutinise the records, and they go through and they scrutinise the records, and they find this charter of King John, and they transcribe it into the roll. So these are actually sometimes a great place to find transcripts of documents that actually don't survive in the original engrossment, but they survive in transcript on a roll such as the memoranda roll or even the plate roll sometimes. And here's another one, just another writ here to do with land. And you can see here, you can clearly see in this case that here's the main body of the text in relatively now, so it's still fairly clear, sharply written, but here you can see this much darker ink is where it tells you that, and later on the 16th of April, next following, the sheriff sent an order to the bailiff of the manor of Leaslip in this case that he was to take action. And then there's another further note that on that day he took into action, but various things happened, and the writ was fully executed, and therefore he's done his job. And again, it's quite a busy section. This is some summons. So this is where they write them first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, blah 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 blah, and it tells you the county there, and then it tells you what it is that's being summoned or what it is they're looking up in the Exchequer record. So there's a variety of different information you can find in the surviving Irish Exchequer records, both the originals that are in Westminster and now at the National Archives here in London, and also still surviving at the National Archives of Ireland. One thing that they have got at the National Archives of Ireland, which is a bit of a boon for historians, is that in the 19th century, the Irish Record Commission, which was modelled on the UK, the English Record Commission, and they produced 60 volumes, I think, of transcripts of memoranda roll proceedings. Now, they're heavily abbreviated. They're quite badly damaged. They were affected by shrapnel. And you can't necessarily trust some of the readings because, these are clerks that are not necessarily trained to read medieval handwriting, and they're trying to reproduce original transcripts. But they're really useful, and the fact they survived means that a lot of information has survived that wouldn't have survived otherwise. And when I say wouldn't have survived otherwise, I'm now referring to one of the first actions of the Irish Civil War in 1922, where the building here on the left is the Four Courts build. This is the Four Courts in Dublin, and here is the old Irish Public Record Office. You can see completely ablaze with its roof off, and there it is closer up. You can see here these bays here. That is the repository where all of these 7 centuries of state records were kept, and the whole lot goes up in a massive explosion. And here's some of the wreckage you can see. Once they started clearing, it's just a tangled mess. There's very little survives apart from fragments and charred ashes. And here is one of our heroes, the Deputy Keeper of Records, Herbert Wood. He's gone out, as you can see, lots of people in the streets of Dublin have gone up and tried to pick up what they can. Surviving records, surviving fragments of parchment papers. It is often described, one of the saddest scenes. Well, it's almost certainly one of the greatest archival disasters in human existence that we know, in human history that we know about. And here is the record treasury itself. There's the repository. This is the records house, which is where people came to search the documents and actually access them. And here in the middle is a fire break. And one of the reasons that the memoranda rolls that I described survived is because we don't know who, but a researcher must have been looking at those 2 rolls or had them out prepared to look at on the 1st of July, say. The fire break was obviously supposed to prevent fire from a coal reading room fireplace in here spreading to a repository, but actually it had the reverse effect in that fire from here didn't spread too severely to here, which meant that a lot of the reading room resources and some of the records that were being consulted on that day survived. And just finally, we might have time to go through this. I don't know whether anybody's played with this already. So since 2019, the Irish government have been funding a project called, firstly, Beyond 2022, and now the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, which has produced intellectual and sort of AI reconstruction of the Public Record Office of Ireland, destroyed in 1922. And the idea is that all of the collections that were once part of that archive can be reconstructed in some way. Now, a lot of them can only be reconstructed sort of fonds, the very top level. But many can, as demonstrated with the receipt rolls, for example, which my colleague Elizabeth Biggs is editing, we can reconstruct them to item level because of the surviving nature of the archive. In our case, obviously in Westminster, there was this audit trail of original records, but throughout the centuries, antiquarians, and in the 20th century, researchers have asked for certified copies or they take their own copies, and they're now stored in public and private archives around the world. And the project has been bringing all of that together for all of the 7 centuries of lost records. And you can now search that, you can browse that, and there are also sort of specific portals. And so the portal for the medieval is something called Cultures of Conquest, where actually we have now produced fully searchable transcripts, English translations, I should say, of the receipt rolls of the medieval Irish Exchequer, the issue rolls. We are working to construct a memoranda rolls portal as well. There is a resource on here called Circle, which the project director Peter Crooks put together, which is basically all of the Irish Chancery letters the letters patent, letters close, which obviously have a lot of financial information in them too. And they're all brought together here, but they're also sort of, document galleries. We have a section on the relationship between Irish kings and English kings on here, which were drawn again from memoranda roll and surviving originals at the Public Record, the National Archives here in London. So it's a very important and growing resource, free to access, free to search, and a lot of we can discuss the technology behind it if time allows. I think I'll finish there, Sean, and let you move on to yours.
Great. Is it right to move straight on seamlessly?
You can stop sharing.
I'll just share my screen.
It's coming.
Okay.
Just go to big screen.
So in a way, I'm going to pick up some of the things that Paul started off with, and really to start with the high point of sort of medieval English structures, which is probably Edward III's reign just before the Black Death. So this is the end of 1347, when he's just fought the Cressy campaign and invaded through Normandy and France. So the height of English kind of military ambition, the height of a kind of financial infrastructure to fund and support that war machine. And the kind of figures here before the population's decimated by the Black Death, quite staggering in terms of the volume of money coming through the king's hands. So £229,000 here, when a taxation would bring in about 34 to 36,000. So England is able to generate this amount of money and focus it in a particular way. So this is largely undone by the Black Death, destroying a lot of the population over the next 2 years after this document was produced. And from that point on, the population is recovering very slowly. Even in the 15th century, it's probably only 2.5 million people in England and Wales. So we're dealing with a kind of human tragedy, which also affects the ability of the crown to generate money, and therefore the processes adapt and change against this. So what I want to talk about is kind of how this is picked up later in the Middle Ages, and talk a little bit about a project I was involved in, which is the Tudor Chamber Books project. Again, creating a digital edition without images, but really just a search and browse text version of the documents, which go into a lot of detail of how the Exchequer offshoots kind of adapted processes to deal with the kind of politics of civil war, which emerged in England. So another civil war, but a bit earlier this time. So we know how, by the end of the Middle Ages, the Exchequer is really, from that high point of sort of the mid 14th century, really denuded down to a very tiny income in comparison. So at the end of the first Tudor reign in 1508-09, they start to produce these declarations of the Treasury, which are a kind of auditor's overview of receipts and issues in the Exchequer on an annual basis, with a list of everyone who's paying in or claiming the money, like a snapshot really, drawn from all these other records that Paul was talking about, from the various auditing processes, the rolls produced in triplicate, the writs and warrants, and the whole system kind of drawn together in a funnel kind of upwards to present possibly the king with this overarching summary, but probably the treasurer and chamberlains in the exchequer needed this high-level figure to be able to manage the flow of money and look to see where they could change emphasis and maybe chase money in different areas. So you can see exchequer's total issue has dropped right down to 3,500. At Henry VII's death, you've got 6,195 being processed. There's some very nice illuminations, I guess, drawings on this, which shows the clerks were quite bored, didn't have enough work to do, so they started drawing pictures. So the exchequer is paying, payments made on these sort of fixed incomes, predictable income from the sheriffs, from county incomes, from rents and fee farms, maybe the profits of justice. It's kind of predictable, but it's really tiny. And we think, well, where's all the money gone? Because if Edward III is generating £250,000 a year, you would just expect the early Tudor period to be at least matching that, having seen off a civil war. And we can see underneath those, because of notebooks of the tellers, who are the clerks who basically receive and pay out money at the counter in the Exchequer in Westminster, we've got a set of the notebooks of a guy called Thomas Stokes, who works from sort of 1485 through to about 1500. And his notebooks show how this process of payments and tracking money works. So in this case, you've got the payments to the royal nursery for the nurses for the princes and princesses. You've got the clerk of the council getting his half-yearly fee, and then a yeoman of the crown getting his whole yearly fee in one lump sum. So you'd have to manage that quite well. You can see here, he's living on £9 a year. And if you were getting paid sixpence a day, which was the basic salary for royal service, you're not getting much more than that in terms of an annual salary. So it gives you some idea of the scale when we talk about these big figures. They really are big in the context of the period. So these are really helpful for working out at a much lower level how the officials who actually got their hands dirty with coin and with tallies actually did the work, and you can plot their kind of day-to-day working. And there's some very nice writs and letters, the occasional recipe that's been dropped over the counter for his wife, medicines as well. So it's quite a human revelation, really, of the people behind the exchequer processes going on. But what I want to talk about is what evolves to kind of run alongside the exchequer as a way to rescue some of the processes. Remember that Henry VII's come to the throne after a civil war, and the 15th century has been a time of civil unrest right the way through, and also successful and then disastrous war in France again. So this is a solution that the Tudors adapted from the Yorkist kings in the 1470s to bring the money much closer to the king's person in his private chambers, to bypass the ancient and predictable but rather slow exchequer process, and have something much more flexible with a very small team, which was really working very close to the king and starting off with money that was linked to the king's person and his private spending, but which eventually developed into an organ of state itself with its own structure, which runs in parallel to the exchequer, but sucks a lot of the money directly from the exchequer and into the chamber. So the chamber's always existed. In Paul's period, the second, we've got some really lovely chamber accounts for this kind of aspect of royal personal spending. But Henry VII combines that with this need to keep his hands on the state's money as well. So the chamber suddenly becomes much more important. And fortunately, we've got the records of it as well. So it's really interesting to us that we can see all aspects of this work. So it's arriving, 1487 is the first chamber book we've got. And to match that, the chamber physically changes the personnel around the king, sets up this kind of buffer zone of lower ranking servants to do day-to-day service, and pushes the aristocrats further away into their counties, into the ceremonial side. They don't have as much contact with the king, so it becomes much more of a functional department, and the people handling this vast amount of money are themselves functional too. So in that sense, it becomes a private kind of financial institution, which we might think as being more secretive, more secluded. It probably was to the people working in it, but to us it's helpful because the streams of money are very much separated. So what we have are these 9 payment books and 3 receipt books for this period, 1485 to 1521. Henry VII is auditing these personally, so he's signing a lot of the entries at quarterly audits, and they're taking the books from Westminster out to wherever he is. So he does a lot of these at his hunting lodges like Woodstock, which is now where Blenheim Palace is. So the books are really nice. And the guy we have to thank for all this is a man called John Heron, who is the treasurer of the chamber, put in charge of this process. He picks up where I guess one of Henry VII's friends, Thomas Lovell, is the first appointee after 1485, and the Chamber's handling loans from the City of London to get the Tudor regime going. But Thomas Lovell is not a financial expert in the same way that Heron is. So under Heron, we see some real evolution of processes quite quickly. And we can know this is sticking because the Queen, Elizabeth of York, adopts the same process for her household, but only one of her books has survived for her final year of life in 1502 to 3. So in itself, very interesting to see the comparison between the King's book, which is a state volume, really dealing with state finance, and the Queen's payment book, which is very much a private, behind the scenes kind of glimpse of the Queen's domestic life. And this is what they look like. Miscellaneous payments as they're received in sequence, processed on a daily basis, in sections within books. So this will be daily payments, and there'll be the bulk of the books are made up like this. Then there'll be other sections for debts, memoranda, which are like to-do lists to chase money or to respond to information where something of benefit to the crown has been noticed by somebody, a courtier or a councillor, a forfeiture of wool or some illegal wine imports or some corruption. So it's a kind of information trail as well as a money trail. Information about royal wards, so tenants in chief who hold from the crown directly when they die without their children being old enough to inherit. The crown will take ownership of that wardship until they're of age and process the money in the same way through these books. And so they're quartered up on, see the summary of the page at the bottom. And then you've got a week summary here, and there'll be quarters and then an annual total, and then each book will have its volume total as well. So John Heron is covering all bases by doing his adding up here. And I think he's pretty good at the maths. As I show later on, there are ways we can see them calculating as well. But he's clearly got the king hovering on his shoulder at every minute here. So he's accounting for farthings and halfpennies as well as for thousands of pounds at a go. And this one's interesting because at the top here you've got the offering in church on Sunday, probably the 22nd of May, 1508. And then just below, you've got a massive bribe to the Habsburgs of £22,000. Well, £28,000, sorry. So basically, the scale is still staggering. If you think the annual income was £36,000 from taxation, that's three-quarters of the crown's income just handed over in jewels to help Maximilian Habsburg become Holy Roman Emperor. So yes, the Tudors had recovered a lot of the financial stability, but were quite happy to spend it in securing their political aims. And this just gives you some idea of the close-up. This is a little section about the funeral accounts of the Queen when she died in 1503, just after giving birth to a daughter. So the Queen's funeral costs 2,300 and a bit pounds. And also their working books. So the king himself is annotating these. He's dealing in bullion speculation. He's buying European écus and gold crowns and converting them into sterling through Calais. He's got agents dealing with his cash investments. He's dealing with Italian merchants as well. He's really keeping an eye on the wool exports and how Calais is, as the hotbed of spying and corruption, how it is kind of kept on track. So there's a lot of attention on Calais as the entrance to Europe for England's wool trade, and also the flow of information about plots and spies against the Tudors comes through this as well. So Henry VII is very present in these records, and Henry VIII, to some extent, is following his father, but becomes less interested quite quickly once he's king. There's better things to do than sit and look at accounts. So on the receipt side, here's Henry VII signing each entry at the audit, which gives the impression he's doing this actually in real time on a daily basis, but that's probably not true. He could have signed each page, but he signed each entry. And this is just interesting for how Southampton as a port has its money reassigned to pay for the king's household. So there's a few £100s here. To pay for the yeomen of the guard, £1,200 is diverted from Southampton for their salaries. and then some other payments are coming in much less visible because they're relating to obligations, to bonds, to recognizances, to suspended fines which are being activated or part payments are being demanded. So you can see the annotations on the side here, different dates of payment. A bit like the issue rolls that Paul was talking about, the dates are marked, although these are audited in quarters of years. The process again is a sequential account of actually day-to-day business being written down as it's processed. And just to sort of go back to that big figure picture, here's the final end of this third receipt book, showing that Henry VII received £366, £366,000, and over the same period spent £338,000. So there's £22,000 in the black on this sort of very high level figure, and this money, it might stay with the chamber, it might be diverted back to the exchequer. This is a flexible system where the king and his officials can basically get round a table and sort out the money processes. And we do this. We can see this from Henry VIII's reign. John Heron is receiving these letters under the signet from the king, which he is signing at this date. Eventually, they create stamps for him. He doesn't want to sign his signature and his little sign manual, his symbol. And so this is money for paying some soldiers on a ship in the war. That's just starting with the sea war with the French. And you can see the notes that John Heron's making down here about the payments. And so we've got hundreds of bundles of these warrants, which show, as Thomas Stokes's papers do for the Exchequer, Heron's notes and warrants and files show how he's working in relation to the king, in relation to other officials, the Lord Treasurer, Thomas Howard, and also all the other teams in different departments to process the money. So we can get a very detailed picture of state finance, and Frederick Dietz and other people have done work on this in the past to kind of explore how these high-level financial processes works in what was basically a financial experiment, which didn't really stick much after the mid-Tudor period. So the Chamber Books Project website has digitized these books as searchable text or as browsable text. So they're the references there. And I just wanted to finish by saying a little bit about the calculations. So on a lot of our documents from the mid-15th century, we see these dots all over the place. And I'll just show you some pictures. You can see some at the bottom right there on the Diet of the Council, and on the bottom of the Queen's account book, just on one of those folios. She's signing each page like the king as her auditing, but the calculations are dotted there. And it's a system of imaginary horizontal lines with imaginary vertical lines, or sometimes real vertical lines, to separate pounds, shillings, and pence, and then possibly farthings and quarters at the end. So the positioning of the dots tells you about above and below the line are single units or fives and tens. And so by placing your dots in these patterns, the accountants are basically drawing out, as they've done in this picture, the cost of all of these bits of food for the Royal Council. So boiling beef, loins of mutton. So you can see that the price of all these items is here. And he's clearly been totting them up in his head and putting the dots down as he gets to a particular set of units that he can then transpose into the next column. And this does add up to the arrangement of the dots. So you can see where it survives the thought process and the mechanics of the accounting clerks making sure and checking their payments. So it's a very good thing to look out for. It's a way we can check their maths without necessarily having to go through all the entries on a page. So certainly from that period, sort of 1470 through to the mid 16th century, this is quite common to see on financial documents of all sorts. I think a lot of the other sort of private receivers in other houses, big houses, or even merchants will be using the same system. So you can see how it kind of evolves into a system which isn't just royal, isn't just state finance, but it seeps into other financial transactions too, because obviously everything is linked in the way that the money flow and income and spending goes. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully we've got some time for questions still. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you ever so much, both Paul and Sean. Absolutely fascinating. And was that a sort of abacus then that they were producing with the dots and the lines?
It looks like it, doesn't it? When we see it on the page. but they're
Hmm.
imagining, you know, from left to right, high to low units, and clearly able to process, and then probably would have had some sort of physical thing as well, I guess, an abacus to move sums
Oh
around.
yeah,
So
like counters and things.
yeah, like the exchequer counter as well. There's a visual element to all of this, and this is just another way of transferring that from one form to another till eventually you can, I guess. Because you don't want to be caught out in the audit. You'd rather
No.
spot these before it goes up.
Absolutely. Do we have some questions from the attendees, please? Do you want to put, can you put hands up or do cameras or put hands? I'm not quite, because I now use Teams all the time. I'm noticing that Steve is putting his camera on, and I'm just wondering if he's got a
Yeah,
question.
I have. Thanks very much, Karen. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for that. It was great to hear from people at the front end of archival management. Um, I'm particularly interested in the people who are actually maintaining these records and performing the audits. And it was wonderful to hear that Henry VII and other royal dignitaries are actually performing their own audits and
Mm.
making their mark as evidence of an audit having been performed. I just wondered if there's anything more that we know about the whole other people around this substantial community of accounting functionaries. Paul mentioned auditors in Ireland.
Mm.
Be interesting to know who they are, and who are the accountants and the accounting clerks. What do we know about these people? Anything at all? What is their background? Where are they gaining their skills
Mm.
in this field? How are they kind of perceived in terms of their social status as individuals working in accounts? I find that really interesting, and I just wondered if we know anything more about that community around the accounting function.
I mean, from the Irish context, I mean, a lot of them are officials that have been brought over from England. They're officials that have worked in an English context. They come over with either a new Lord Lieutenant or a new Archbishop, say. At the very top level, a lot of the royal officials, so the treasurer, for example, or the Chancellor of the Exchequer, they're very senior clerks. They're educated churchmen. They're probably, they've had a career in ecclesiastical career and then also a career in officialdom. Edward the First and Edward the Second are very, very good at nurturing talent from quite low levels of the clerical hierarchy and bringing them forward through administrative practice. There was a really strong, particularly in the 14th century, a really strong line of clerical administrators who are actually probably administrators first rather than clergymen. And a lot of these are the people who are at the highest levels of the government hierarchy. A lower level again, a lot of them are, minor clerks, not necessarily beneficed. Some of them are beneficed, but obviously in Ireland there are a few benefices going around, so a lot of them are paid a fee. You will get, in terms of the audit process, it is, the audit is done by the treasurer and the chamberlains, and also the barons of the exchequer, who are, these senior experienced officials who are supposed to know exchequer practice. And of course, both in England and in Ireland, and I'm sure in the chamber, there are manuals of practice. So we at the National Archives have got quite a large collection of so late 13th, early 14th century Exchequer reference manuals. There's not just the Red Book and the Black Book of the Exchequer, but there are things called Liber A and Liber B, so Book A and Book B, which record lots and lots of practical things like oaths. There are transcripts of key documents related to key functions or key parts of the English Empire, say, which officials need to know about and regularly refer back to. So I don't know, Sean, do you want to talk a bit later on?
Yeah, but by my period, there's a very much a professional auditing team who have a very narrow career and don't really break out into other areas where they're more visible. In the chamber, the clerks like John Dauncey and Richard Trees become figures of visibility. So they acquire land and they have London houses and they get paid well because they're close to the king and people want to use them as ways to get the king's ear. So they can see that the flexible process also breathes a kind of flexible kind of social dimension to their role. So they become more visible in different types of records, but at their heart, they've been picked because they have this financial skill. And I guess it comes from Reynold Bray, who's Margaret Beaufort's receiver back in the 1470s when she's just a younger countess, and he's managing her lands around Woking. And when Henry Tudor is in exile, he helps Margaret kind of survive in a hostile environment. And once Henry is king, he moves into these financial positions because we've got Westminster Abbey in her archive. We've got his account books from when he's very junior, managing her land. So you can see the evolution of his skills in a kind of private capacity, translated into the crown kind of functions, and it might be he who's kind of responsible for a lot of the way the chamber works. So yeah, the clerks are interesting people. They start doing many different things. So that guy Thomas Stokes in the Exchequer, he's a kind of treasurer for war in 1489 for a little campaign in Brittany. He goes down to Portsmouth, sits in a tent, basically paying out money, doing what he would be doing in Westminster, but to ships' captains and sailors. So they get involved in physically taking the money to support different activities, not just in their Westminster base. So it's very, very interesting. Some work's been done on them. Similar with the writing clerks in the Chancery, we've got precedent books for their business, and again, they're quite visible. And there was some work done in the 60s and 70s to try and identify them as a rolling body of civil servants doing all of the work. So it's an area that could do with a bit more attention again. I think it's been 50 years probably since it's really been explored at that level of productivity. People tend to focus on the officers of state and what their responsibilities are for the machinery. That doesn't really change, but there's clearly people who can influence techniques and evolve things quite quickly just from their personal force of will almost.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yes. Christopher.
Thank you very much. A really interesting presentation. One quick comment and then my question. I think I heard somebody just mention in passing that the dots could be similar to how things were laid out on the checkerboard. I think that's certainly worth investigating. Years ago I went to a demonstration of how the checkerboard worked, and it looked very much the same sort of layout. The question I have, though, is you've talked about the Exchequer accounts, you've talked about the chamber accounts, but there must have been lots of other standalone accounting systems going on at this time. One thing that came to my mind was Henry VIII's wardrobe accounts, which I remember the historian David Starkey studied in great detail about 30 years ago. Were all these separate accounts always separate, or was there any sort of process by which they were sort of brought together and summarized on a regular basis?
Yeah, definitely.
The first thing you showed was
yeah, those that great wardrobe account, certainly in the earlier period, the wardrobe is very much a much bigger department, and the household as well, sort of sitting alongside each other, all being fed by the Exchequer. And there's still a great wardrobe which which is a physical building near the Blackfriars, which is dealing not just with the king's clothing, but all the cloth, a lot of machinery, and armor and weapons. So there's a central store which has its own accounting process. A lot of these will have fed into enrolled accounts by subject, which is part of the auditing. And then the Tudors invent a declared accounting system, which is an oral declaration as an audit as well. And so we've got declared accounts from about 1500, which are basically collating all these other strands in separate headings and often over several years together in one bound roll, which turns out to be enormous. So yes, you're right. They draw this information together, and the chamber is one aspect of this other process, which is all going on in the background.
And the one interesting thing about the wardrobe in the earlier periods, in the 13th, 14th century, the late 13th, early 14th century, England is a roll nation in terms of its record keeping. However, the wardrobe is the one part of government which adopts the book format quite, what would you say, systematically. We think it's probably the influence of Italian merchants, because we've actually, so the Exchequers, in the Exchequer archive that we have, they swept up the papers of the Riccardi and the Frescobaldi in sort of the early 14th century, and you can see there's a clear comparison between those accounts and what the what the wardrobe produces. Of course, in theory, the wardrobe actually is audited by the Exchequer, but the wardrobe is a much more flexible system for the king to raise money for what he wants to do rather than what the state needs. It's much more of a personal sort of accounting system, isn't it, I guess?
So
Thank you.
anything which involves an officer receiving and processing the king's money will have some sort of accounting, whether that's ships or making tents or the marches of Wales or the Scottish border. So the paper trail is one way that they can be tested on their probity and their performance in office almost. So a lot of the paper receipts don't survive. A lot of what we call particulars of account, which are the accounts drawn up by the officials and then sent in for the auditing process. They happen to have survived. They would probably have been thought about as being disposable. And there's all sorts of bundles of receipts and calculations before that formal process starts, just because people's papers were swept up in the process. So we're lucky that we have this whole range of evidence, a lot of it in still fairly disorganized, catalogued form, but still it's a real depth of information to follow money trails in various ways.
Yeah, one thing we didn't say, we haven't really said, is that certainly for the early period, about the chamber, it's a charge and discharge system. It's not a sort of simple ledger system, whatever. It's you have your charge, the money that you've received and you're supposed to have received to fulfill your role, and then you're supposed to discharge that by producing tallies, receipts, evidence that you were given an allowance for having done something, whatever. So it's quite complicated, but it's the way that accounts are laid out. A lot is often quite straightforward to follow if you know the system.
Yeah.
Interesting. Paul mentioned something about perhaps the books of the wardrobe being books linked with the Italian merchants. And I just wonder if Alan might have a question or something related to that, given that that's his area, Italian medieval merchants.
Well, it wasn't really something that was coming into my mind very much. But apart from the fact that when I was looking at the examples that you were presenting of the accounts, I was busy looking at the handwriting, to be honest, and slightly a little bit at the numbers. But no, and I did notice the mention of the Italians a couple of times, but clearly there didn't appear to be any interconnection between the accounting of one and the accounting of the other, because they're so different. And I suppose it would be interesting to know if there's any documents that have survived that give an account, in the sense of a description maybe, of the sorts of transactions and dealings that were taking place between the Italians and the crown. I would imagine banking was part of it, but money being lent and borrowed would be something, and maybe sending money across for payment. But was there any sort of information about how the connection with the Italians worked, and have we any evidence of the sort of transactions that were taking place between the English?
There is an awful lot of evidence relating to the Italians' participation in the wool trade, for example, because obviously it's one of the main ways of funding loans, etc. That the Italians had liquid capital. It's English growers, the crown, whatever, had that asset they could sell. So there are lots of accounts relating to the debts of individual farmers, etc., to Italians for wool transactions. There's a lot of forward buying of wool, for example, in the late 13th century. There's quite a lot of evidence of that in the Exchequer accounts. Where you can see that there's a deal being struck by an agent in the field with let's say, a monastic house for buying a certain amount of wool for a certain price for a certain amount of years in the future to guarantee that best quality product for that particular merchant house, that banking house, or whatever. It's probably less so in terms. You get later material relating to the loans of the Bardi, for example, to Edward III, don't you think? And you see the credit relationship there, where the crown has to pawn a lot of its jewels to the Italians because it can't pay them in cash. So I think there's one stage like two crowns, I think, they get pawned to the Italians because Edward III's got nothing else he can give. He's not, he's spending all of his money on continental campaigns.
Yeah,
the Bardi are bankrolling him.
You see a lot in the recorder section of the memoranda roll, where the Exchequer is writing up cases or licenses, and there's also sections where royal letters are duplicated, so the exchequer officials know what's been granted by the crown. And so you'll pick up, say, if the Spanish merchants are running an exchange, but the crown's allowed it, or there's been an allowance at Southampton for certain imports of wine. There'll be a record of that grant, and you can see then there's a trail to follow in other parts of the collection for more detail, perhaps. So it's fascinating. We've got to move room, I'm
Yeah,
afraid.
we're still coming. We've just been kicked out of a room by direct.
Thank you.
And actually, that's an absolutely perfect place to take a very, very quick 5-minute break. We
Brilliant.
started
Excellent.
5 minutes
Well,
late. We'll
we're
start
going
the
to go
next
off the video
section
now.
5 minutes later,
We'll
if that's okay.
reappear somewhere
We'll
else.
be back in
So
30 seconds.
top up your coffee
Thank
or
you.
whatever it is you need, and then we
Yeah.
will move on to the next half. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating.
We've only got that for half an hour as well.
Am I sharing the screen of the schedule? Don't know if you would like to share your slides, Sean. The other Sean. Sean Power, not Sean Cunningham. Thank you. And for the second half of our presentation today, or our webinar on archives today, we have our own Niamh Brennan and Sean Bradley Power to present about their insights from digitizing and digitalization of accounting history records. So over to you, Sean.
Okay,
Niamh.
yeah, I'm going to introduce our presentation and then hand over to Sean. So I'll start by saying good morning to everybody and thank Karen for organising this session. And as the presentation is based on a paper which is just out in the American Accounting Association's Accounting Historians Journal. And we were incredibly lucky because we drew two outstanding reviewers, which really, really helped us to improve our paper. So I want to acknowledge that. It was an excellent review experience. So our data comes from three archival sources, which Sean will tell you more about. And the first data set concerns the British South Africa Company, which Cecil Rhodes used to colonise Rhodesia. And luckily, and I wasn't involved at this point in time, but Sean met Christopher Napier, who's on the call. And Christopher gave him an outstanding piece of advice, which was to collect absolutely everything. And Sean collected 29 annual reports, no missing data whatsoever, containing 34 financial statements and a pretty solid set of verbatim general shareholder meetings. And that's the first company, and the British South Africa Company was listed on the London Stock Exchange, and it was a government in Rhodesia, and therefore the annual reports were much, much longer than normal annual reports in those days. And the second company is the Forestall Land, Timber and Railway Company, La Forestale, also listed on the London Stock Exchange, and it extracted corbacho from trees in Argentina to manufacture tannin for use in making leather goods. And when Sean and I started collaborating after he had collected his 29 annual reports, that's when we got the idea of digitizing the data set. And one of the reviewers kind of said, what was our plan? And I'm sorry to have to confess, we didn't have a plan. It was just a gut feeling that if we had the material in a digital format, it would make things easier from an analytical point of view. And then the British South Africa Company, masses and masses have been written about the company and about Cecil Rhodes. But I think our unique ability to make a contribution is because we approached the company from the perspective of an annual report and financial statements, and then the governance as it played out in the shareholder meetings. So notwithstanding all that's been written about the company, we think that we are able to make a contribution because of our data set. So at this point, I'll hand over to Sean.
Thanks, Niamh. So in the next few slides, I'll talk about our chosen method, which was to digitize mostly physical archival material, and then to use a mix of automated methods and manual analysis of that material. Let me just try. Okay. So our starting point for both of these companies was the case company. So we had a bit of background information about the British South Africa Company and also the Forestell Land Timber and Railways Company. And then we had to set about finding if there was any archival material available. And the National Archives discovery tool was very useful. It helped us to identify the Gull archive at the Derbyshire Record Office, which is a huge, very rich archive of material. Philip Gull was the director of the company from 1898 into the 1920s, and he kept meticulous records on the operations of the company and various communications of the company that are held at Derbyshire Record Office. But the discovery tool doesn't, there are some collections which are not indexed within the discovery tool. And so the Forestell Land, Timber and Railways Company doesn't show up in the search results of the discovery tool, but we read up on papers that were written about the company, checked references, footnotes, and we were able to identify archival material at the Guildhall Library in London. Once we had identified that material, our first big challenge was with the catalogs. So the Derbyshire Record Office, they have sorted the Gull archive according to document type. So the collection is already organized by annual reports, board minutes, shareholder meetings, mining activities, railways. So it's quite useful in that it's when requesting documents and looking for the archive, it's already organized to some extent. And within each collection, each reference refers to a document. So the referencing system goes up to document level, which again for the annual reports is very useful because you can see in advance which annual reports are available, and it gives a brief description of the document. The Guildhall Library was a bit tricky with their catalogue. They have a list of all of the annual reports are stored together in boxes, and they have a list of boxes which are sorted by year, industry, and the first letter of the company name. But you never really know which industry the company is in. And for example, with the La Forestell, the industry changed over the period of analysis. So from 1905 to 1965, there were two changes in the industry, which were quite disruptive to our collection process because we then had to go and find which industry it was listed under. And the way that their system works is once you suspect it's within a particular industry, you have to order the yearbook, which is not digitized. It's not available virtually. And you have to look through the list of companies within the yearbook to see if the company is within that category within that year. So these catalogs created some challenges for our approach to collecting, digitizing the material. It gives some useful information, but the catalogs don't tell you how long the documents are. And so it's very difficult because our approach involves collecting everything. We don't spend much time at the archive doing any analysis. The objective is just to spend the archive time photographing and collecting as much as possible and then bringing it back to the office for later analysis. But if you don't know how long the documents are, it's very difficult, especially since I don't live in the UK, it would be a planned trip to budget how much time to spend at the archive. And so it's guesswork to some extent when deciding on how much time to set aside for the archive visit. We also discovered another challenge, which was it's very difficult to know whether or not the text is very rich and good material for analysis or whether it's just boilerplate text. So in 2016, when the first set of annual reports on the British South Africa Company was collected, I was relatively lucky in that I didn't know in advance that these annual reports were such long and rich documents, often over 100 pages in length. In contrast, the Forrestal reports at the Guildhall Library were incredibly boilerplate. So maximum 1, 2 pages each year, and it's pretty much the same boilerplate material, just with the numbers and years changed year on year. So it's not very good material for analysis. So with the Forrestal case, I spent 2 weeks collecting those annual reports, but at the same time, we didn't really end up using the material. So to some extent, it was a bit of inefficient use of the time. We ended up using a commercial database of Times newspaper articles for our subsequent analysis. We also face challenges when digitizing with how to collect the material. We had to decide between hand scanners, phones, tablets, or cameras. And at the time in 2016, cameras and tablets that didn't have as powerful software as they have today in terms of transcribing the text. And there were a number of factors that we had to consider. The ability to take a photo with one hand if we're handling the document. If there's in a later slide, I talk about some of the issues with document handling. Another issue that popped up was where the paper is compressed into the spine of the document and you have to angle the camera, which to some extent rules out using a stand or some kind of fixed apparatus to photograph the material. And also volume. So we took, during the archive visits, thousands of photos. We were taking hundreds of photos each day over a 2-week period. And so the device needs to be able to handle continuous and repeated photographs. And also the ability to review the quality of the photograph immediately after taking it to check if there's any issues for later transcription. So I eventually decided with using a camera. In the photograph, you can see a Canon camera, which in 2016 was a relatively new camera, but it's quite aged at the moment. I'll talk about a drawback with that in a moment. But one of the issues with the camera was from this style of data collection was battery life. So the battery camera lasts about 3 hours, and then it requires about a 3-hour charge. And so the first day in 2016 at the archive, I wasted an incredible amount of time because I ran out of battery life. And then I spent about half a day walking around Matlock trying to find an electronics store that would sell additional batteries. But then I put together a nice system where I would have a battery charging while I was using a particular battery. And then I would just switch them over once the battery life expired. And this allowed me to just continuously collect photos throughout the day and maximize my time at the archive. One challenge that I was ignorant to initially, but I became very conscious of later is the sound the camera makes every time we took a photo. So when I took a photo, this particular model of camera clicks, and I read in an article, someone mentioned that this can be quite annoying for other people around in the archive. And I had been completely ignorant to this issue. But once I knew about it, I started to become more conscious and notice it a lot more. And so although I haven't resolved that yet, I know the newer models of Canon are silent. And so hopefully I can resolve that problem in the future. The camera... The Canon camera is relatively useful because you can hold it with one hand, and in addition, it allows you to review each photo for 2 seconds, which helps just to check that it's not blurred. And so once you go back to the office, you don't have to make document requests for blurry photos at a later date. So part of the Gull archive also, part of the Gull collection is on microfilm, which makes the process a lot easier. This tended to be the parts of the collection that were handwritten documents. So BSA 3, which is letters and personal correspondence of Gull. And this was a far more efficient process because part of the work had been done by the archive. So in this photo on the left is the archive catalog of the microfilm, and they give a few sentences about the nature of each letter, which is really useful. So in advance, I just read through this catalog and I selected letters of interest. and then I just ordered the microfilms, and you can see the USB stick at the base of the screen. It was just a matter of finding the appropriate document and saving it to USB. One challenge that I faced at various points was had to do with communicating adequately with the archive in advance. So normally, because I was collecting such large volumes of photographs during the archive visit, it's each day really counts. And so usually I would go for a 2-week period, and archives, typically Derbyshire Record Office and the Guildhall Library, are only open to the public 4 days of the week, which cuts about 20% of what I thought was the available time to take photographs. But also they have staff training days and use the archives for other events. And so one challenge we faced was just communicating with the archive in advance and making sure that we had pre-booked a table, especially if it's during a particularly busy period, and just to check which days they were open and if they had any events coming up. Okay, so I think getting more into the digitization process, it's quite a tedious process, and it's very labor intensive, although that I think is in the process of changing with new software and new technology. But some of the issues that we encountered when digitizing the photographs are the condition of the documents. So at the top left is board minutes from the Derbyshire Record Office, and there's a tear in the page. So this page can't be digitized, and will be a missing page from the material. Also, another issue is mold. So in the top right, you can see some mold coming through on the page. And this is a big issue for character recognition when you try to transcribe the page using software. Sometimes the software picks up these spores and doesn't know what to do with it. And so the whole page has to effectively be typed up. That's fine if it just affects one page, but if it affects multiple pages, you have to type up each page without the assistance of software, which is a very time-consuming process. Also, the storage of the documents was a major challenge when taking the photographs, and we got around this challenge just by making sure that we talked to the archivists regularly, found out what they were comfortable with in terms of document handling. So in the bottom left, these are board minutes, and each set of board minutes has been stapled in the top left corner. And sometimes the staple can overlap quite a bit of text on the page, depending on how carefully it's been done. The archives have different rules and guidelines, but sometimes they'll let you remove the staple. Sometimes they will come and remove the staple for you, but it is possible to collect that page. It's not a lost page in the collection process. At the Guildhall Library, another major challenge we faced was they stored their annual reports in big bound folders, but they get quite thick, especially from the 1940s to 1965. And so the binding becomes quite rudimentary in the later years, and you have big, thick sets of annual reports bound in a very basic way. And you can see the effect of this in the bottom right corner, where the pages start to fold into the spine, and it becomes very difficult to read the annual report text with the naked eye. But at the same time, it becomes very difficult to photograph that text because it's on a slope as it goes down into the spine, and it's very difficult for a camera to focus and to get the text clearly because of the uneven level of the page. So the archivists do allow some level of document handling. So folds, for example, as long as it's not glued or stuck, in which case you can't unfold it. But if it's just a simple fold, they allow you to apply pressure to the page and to unfold or unscrumple pages to take the photograph. They also provide weighted cushions and weighted beads, for example, to help you weigh down pages to take your photographs. And also some level of pressure being applied to to separate the pages around the spine of the document is permitted in the archive. Another major challenge that we faced was referencing. So when you're taking thousands of photos over 2 weeks, it's quite difficult to also maintain the references. But later on, when you're done with the analysis and you write up a paper, you obviously have to go and have a very detailed list of references for where the material came from. We developed a basic system to keep track of the references, but it's not as efficient as I think it could be. But we essentially would, before photographing a document, I would zoom in on the reference. So the first photo before the photographs of the document would be the reference number. And the references weren't sent for digitization. The way we organized the photos was they were organized by document type. So a particular year's annual report would be in a folder, for example, and it would come back to us in a document according to the folder that it had been stored in. So we would have a separate text document for each annual report, for example. But then once we had written the paper and the paper was at a late stage, I would then manually go back and look in the folders of original photographs to get the reference and to build up the list of references. I'm sure there must be a better way to do this, a more efficient way, but that's how we manage it at the moment. When it comes to the accounting documents, it's very tricky with the financial statements themselves to digitize this material. So at the end of 19th century, early 20th century, the annual reports that I flicked through at the Guildhall Library and at Derbyshire Record Office, they typically are spread across 2 pages. But these 2 pages are, when they're digitized, there'll be no relationship between the pages recognized with the digitized text. But there is structure to these pages, and the structure has meaning. So on the left, you would have the different equity and liability accounts and their subtotals. And on the right, you would have an equal amount of assets and investments that have been made by the company. And this structure is completely lost in the digitization process. So we made a decision not to bother digitizing the financial statements. Whenever we needed them or we wanted to analyze something on them, we would call up the original photos and do it manually. The only aspect of the balance sheet that we decided to digitize was the audit reports that were shown on the face of the balance sheet. And so typically when collecting these, I would take a photo of the 2 pages together to remember that these pages should be viewed together. And then for clarity, I took a photo of each individual page to make sure that the numbers and the descriptions were clear, and then separately the audit report. It was the same for Forrestal, balance sheet across 2 pages. These pages have structure. The structure has meaning. And in addition, with Forrestal, they present at times a profit and loss statement on their balance sheet. And again, this isn't random. This will be completely lost by digitization, but this profit and loss is related to the balance sheet. And there's meaning in the relationship between the positioning of these 2 documents that gets lost in digitization. So we just decided not to digitize the financial statements. There's also some really interesting features in the annual reports of the British South Africa Company, and we weren't too sure what to do with them because it's not easy to digitize them in an effective way to support a future analysis. So the British South Africa Company counts a lot of stuff. They have a lot of tables in their annual reports, but these tables obviously have structure to them. And to digitize the table, software makes a reasonable first run at it, but it does require careful review. And because the numbers are quite close together, there's often errors in the converted tables. So we decided not to convert these. We did use them subsequently in some papers, but we manually typed them into Excel spreadsheets rather than trying to go through the digitization process. We also didn't digitize graphs. And another really interesting feature of the British South Africa Company's annual reports are these big, quite nice looking maps that are contained in several of their annual reports. And these maps are bigger than the standard page of the annual report. They're typically printed on better paper, and they fold out into approximately A3 size. But it's very difficult to photograph the maps because of their size. They're typically overflowing on the workspace in the archive. Because they're so large, you have to get the camera up very high to try and fit the map into the photograph while it's flopping over the table, for example. And so although I photographed them, oh, it's also very difficult to keep the page flat because it's crumpled, it's old, and it's very large. And so although I photographed them, what we did eventually, we did an analysis of the maps. It's a working paper at the moment, but we made a special request to the archive we gave them the page numbers and the documents that they were contained in, and they have much better equipment that's able to capture these bigger pages with better lighting and laid much flatter. And so we requested the maps and ordered them from both Derbyshire Record Office and the National Archives at Kew, and they sent us very high quality images, which facilitated our analysis. One thing that I think is a little bit disappointing about using more automated methods, so the purpose of digitizing the text would be to use or to facilitate the use of more automated methods in the analysis. But in the GAL archive, I think one of the richest sources of information is personal letters and correspondence of GALs, which is held in a particular collection. And these provide amazing insights, amazing context for the studies, but it's very difficult to digitize these. And so we've heard about from talking to researchers, we've heard that there is software that's becoming increasingly powerful, which makes an attempt at digitizing handwritten text. But we made the decision not to digitize it. We still used it because it was so rich and insightful. The annual reports were publicly available and they were distributed to journalists, whereas these letters are much more confidential, much more behind the scenes insights of the issues that the directors were facing at the time. What we decided to do was not to digitize the handwritten letters, but we refer to them. So if we want additional context or we're interpreting a particular result, we'll go and look at the letters, and sometimes we draw additional insights by manually calling upon this material. So the whole purpose, or one of the main purposes of digitization was to enable some level of automated analysis. So the process of getting the data into a digitized format is incredibly time consuming. It's expensive. It's quite tedious at times. But once you have the text documents on hand, it really helps to facilitate digitalization and some of the automated analyses that you can do. So you can feed this data into a range of different software, and it's possible to do quite powerful analyses with them. So in some of our papers, we used Python and Python packages. For example, for the annual reports, we have the annual reports of a 35-year period. We generated a word frequency table over that entire corpus, and we used that word frequency table to generate bags of words. And then we were able to do a keyword analysis over the 35-year period using these bags of words. And we did it relatively efficiently. I think doing the same exercise manually would take significantly more time than we were able to do it in. So at the end of the paper, we provide a checklist of practical advice. It's not guidelines. This isn't, we don't claim it's a comprehensive list or that there aren't areas of this that can't be improved or done in alternative ways. It's just from our own experiences, reflecting on them, some of the mistakes that we made and some costly mistakes at times in terms of time, especially. We just provide a checklist of practical advice for people that want to do archival research for the same time, and just to sort of try and help them feel maybe a bit more comfortable during their first visit at the archive and to avoid some of the mistakes that we've made over the last decade.
Thank you very much, Sean and Neve, for coming and giving your reflections on compiling historical databases from archival sources. As you say, it's very useful for people visiting because we all experience exactly the same issues and problems. So it's very useful to have a bit of a checklist if you're a new researcher. I can see someone has their hand up. I'm afraid I don't know you, or at least perhaps I can't see you because you're a little tiny square at the top of my, and it says Gigi Bini.
Desmond,
That's
yeah.
not really your name, so perhaps you. Oh, hello.
Okay. Hello, Karen. Thank you very much for a lovely morning so far. Thank you, Sean. That was a fascinating, very practical and informative. Just two questions. So you took all these photographs, and then later on, then they became, documents. Firstly, did you maintain then the integrity? So say that you're taking the 1905 annual report, did you kind of recreate that as a separate standalone document, i.e., when you extracted all of the text from the photograph into it? Or so did you kind of almost replicate the archive in document by document? Or that's the first question. So if you want to.
Yes. So initially, I was doing it myself, and I was just sort of experimenting with methods to do it. So I was opening them up in Google Docs, which in 2016, 2017 was the best method to have a first run at converting the photograph into digitized text. But there's several errors, and even today, I've tried ChatGPT. There's nothing that is sort of 100% effective. There's always mistakes in the conversion. So the tedious part of it really was reviewing each page with a fine-tooth comb, making sure that the mistakes in the digitization were corrected. So I did it myself for a few months, and then we started to use a professional transcription company who use a mix of software and then also typists. But I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but we didn't, when we were doing the transcription, we didn't keep the pages exact. We just have it as one flowing text. So we didn't maintain the page numbers because we're just feeding it into some of the time into software, which doesn't acknowledge the page structure.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Because at least then you have, say, the 1905 annual report, and the page numbers don't matter. Thank you very much. The second question was, when you're taking all these photographs, and I've experienced this myself, like you have masses and masses of photos. Some archives ask you to fill in a handwritten sheet listing all the individual photos you took, which can be quite time consuming. Now, I have occasionally seen archives where they have a nominal charge per image, but usually they may waive that. So I don't what your experience of that has been. And then, of course, related to that is you need to be very careful that there is internet Wi-Fi available in an archive. So just wondering how your experience of, were you asked, or did you, for your own purpose, keep a list of every image? Thank you.
Yeah, so we had to sort of fill in the document, the licensing, etc. And it wasn't in terms of the cost. They have the daily rate, and then you sort of get a discount if you pay 5 days in advance. It wasn't too expensive to do this over 2-3 weeks. But you're right. Both archives, the Derbyshire Record Office and the Guildhall Library, require you to, on the back of that permission document, to fill in every single document that you've photographed. But we were quite lucky in that because we're photographing series of documents that are within the same collection, you would order a box, for example, at Derbyshire Record Office, and that box would contain several different folders. So if you give the box number, for example, you don't have to list every single individual document because we would be photographing everything within the box.
Thank you. And actually, I was going to call on Martin because this is obviously his very expert area, but he's got his hand up anyway. So, Martin.
Thanks, Karen. I'll never claim to be an expert in anything. I suppose my big comment, Sean, is I think you're missing a trick in that you said you have, I don't know, I can't remember, 20 something, 30 something years. And some of those reports, is it of the South African company, are maybe 100 pages long or longer.
Yeah.
And I absolutely agree with everything you've said. The problems, the difficulties, the curvatures, the whatever, and absolutely technology has moved on. But maybe you're missing a trick in that if the data is large enough, so what if there's errors?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you're going to miss words off pages. And recently done a much, much smaller company, about 3 pages per annual report, but it's like 1883 to 1963. I know there's errors in there, and I done a spot check. I said, yeah, about 3-4% of the words are missing. Who cares if you've got it over such a long period, or your volume is so large? And that's like the big data approach, isn't it? So just keep that in mind. I think, you know, you don't need to spend, you need to be confident your data is accurate, but it's never, as you said yourself a short while ago, to be 100% accurate. And just forget about that. Because if you've got large volumes and long time series, so what? So that's my big comment. So, but well done.
Well, Martin,
Yeah,
I'll just chip in and say that when we use the professional transcriber, the level of accuracy was absolutely incredible. In one case, a reviewer, very picky reviewer, was questioning the punctuation. And we went back to the original, and the punctuation as transcribed was absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
So if there are errors in your data, you better watch out for picky reviewers.
We'll ignore those reviewers now. And to be fair, if you're doing a sentiment analysis or anything like that, punctuation's removed, so it doesn't matter. You know, but like I've been lucky, just to share something with you all, 1790s ledgers and Guinness. The only way to do them is to probably type them, because they're massively heavy, about 20 kilos, huge curves. You can't separate them. You won't digitize them. They're handwriting. So that's probably how you got such good results. Somebody was reading and typing, you know. But well done. Well done.
Alan?
Certainly, I think for if there is an acceptable error rate with the digitization of the documents, that's where a lot of the time is spent, is in the review. So if it's possible to cut that down, it makes the process more efficient.
Well, all statistical researchers are happy with 95% confidence, so work off that. If they can get away with it, why can't we?
Brilliant. Good point. Alan?
Yeah, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation, and a very interesting paper, if I might say. There's one or two things. Martin's touched on a couple of things that I would have mentioned, but at least I could mention them still. I think in terms of I mean, I have no idea who might have raised the question about commas, but I might have raised it, because commas change the sense of a sentence. So I wouldn't just ignore them. In terms of the little things that I noticed as you were going through, the marks on the page, which meant it was difficult to, as what you call digitize, but you'd already digitized them in photos, but digitize them so you could electronically read them. I think there's ways around some of that, because I've done it to some extent, in that you just change you use software to change the shading of the page, you increase the contrast and all the rest of it. But Martin and I had an interesting discussion a few weeks ago about the use of Google Translate to do translations, digital translation of text, where if you use the camera in Google Translate, it can do a digital conversion into a different language, that when I go into the same document on my computer and try and do an OCR version and scrape it off, it won't do it. So I think the technology is certainly developing all the time, where you can get these things done where we couldn't in the past. On your torn page, the fact the page is torn, it's a bit like Martin's point, where the commas don't matter or whatever. But the torn page doesn't matter. You just digitize what's left, and sometimes you'll find something in that half page that's really very important. But so I wouldn't just ignore those. The point about missing, going back to this almost the same point as before, but missing words when you're trying to get a full transcription digitally of what was in it, and you miss words out, I think you should always go back and check what was it, were the words if you're going to use that particular statement. So it's fine not to bother when you're doing it because it saves an awful lot of time. But if you think something's interesting, you need to go back and check it. And the final thing that came to my, two things. Scanners do flatten text, but I went back to Venice in September, especially to scan a ledger because I'd used my scanner there in a year earlier. And I turned up at the archive expecting to spend over 4 hours, and I'd done 3 pages, and the archivist came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You can't use scanners, they're banned in Italy." So the Italians have banned scanners in their archives. And I'd spent 4 days instead of 4 hours and I had to use an iPad instead of a scanner, so I've got pages like this. Anyway, and the other thing that struck me as amazing with microfiche, I used a microfiche I've used several, but the one that comes to mind is in Florence. And I was there in June, I think it was. And I had the archive has put this old ledger onto microfiche 60 years ago. I don't think anyone's ever looked at it. But anyway, I was going through it, and it contains about 4 different extracts from it's actually 4 different ledgers joined together in the archive. But going through it, they'd not only missed out 22 of the pages out of the ledger, but in some cases, the archivist's hand was in the middle of the picture. It was a completely messy job. And on top of that, when I tried to read some of it, everything was very imprecise and blurry, and I've seen that before. There's a document in Venice that only exists on archive, and it's a 1-page thing, and it's almost impossible to read it because the microfilm that was used, the microfilm that was at the time in 1939 was not a very high quality picture. So I'm staggered that you managed to get a lot of good work out of microfiche. And so maybe I'll have a second look at that. But I just wonder, what do you think the future is going to be for people doing digitization of archival records? Do you think it's going to come? How is it going to change? Are we 5 years from now going to find it easy, or 10 years, or 20? What do you think?
I think definitely since 2016, when I was manually sort of trying to convert those photographs to text. And if you compare that until now, the rate of change with software is incredible. And I think it's only getting faster. So I think that probably maybe the archives themselves, if they adopt some of this technology, it maybe in the future will be easier for them to digitize handwritten and typed text and just make it available more freely online, perhaps.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fabulous, thank you. And I think now is a really good point to move to our more general discussion on archival research.
Karen,
and I'm hoping that
Richard has his hand up.
I'm hoping that Richard has a question that we can then use to launch us into that general discussion. Richard.
Thanks very much. Yeah, this is just a couple of comments. Unexpected problems. Well, as you know, I've done quite a bit of work in China, but it wasn't until I'd spent several days being entertained by various officials and given wonderful dinners that they very embarrassedly said, "I'm afraid foreigners can't go into the archive." So luckily, I always worked with a Chinese colleague, and of course he could go into the archive. So that was the technology is not a problem. Their technology is terrific, but as you might expect with China, the politics are a problem. So if it wasn't for, we're waiting for something at the moment where the National Library is supposed to be producing digital copies, but it's already taken 3 years, and there's no time scale given for when it will be available. The other thing is the main advantage with the Chinese documents is that the ink that they used and which they were using several hundred years ago is still as clear today as it was when it was written. So you have this wonderful black ink which has survived for hundreds of years and you can still read it. Um, so the problems when you go abroad may be even worse than they are here.
Yeah. Even here, I've done work at the Samuel Pepys Library in Cambridge, and there you're not allowed to take photographs. So you look at a document and you're supposed to sort of transcribe it by hand, but if you're limited on time, that's almost impossible. That's when I would say, actually, talk to your archivist. I made friends with the archivist, and she finally allowed me to take photos for my own personal use. So,
There
which
was
is
a
a really
wonderful,
good place to perhaps bring in our archivists.
there was a wonderful archivist at the National Records in Scotland, in Edinburgh. There are these huge ledgers of the Carron Company from the 1600s, but they were all damp. They'd all stuck together. But luckily, I managed to get the archivist interested, and very painstakingly, they unstuck them and then made copies of all the pages. So, as you say, the archivist, it's very important to get the archivist on side.
Do our lovely archivists have any comments about us using archives or any thoughts around the discussions we've had so far? That wasn't a very specific question, was it? Sorry, Sean and Paul. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, hang on. Is that better?
Yeah, perfect.
So only that collections are so varied and the history before they come to an archive center, I guess, where you can access them is so miscellaneous and subject to all kinds of problems. A lot of these difficulties are inherited by current archive services, which are horribly underfunded, very understaffed, as you've experienced, limited access hours, probably haven't got much of a collections care scientific team. So the whole problem is exacerbated, and that links into sort of archival skills and their decline as well. So although in the 70s it was a different problem in terms of getting text transferred from one format to another or digitization or microfilm, you probably had an archivist who knew what they were doing. Whereas now, a lot of archives are so stretched, the archivist has to do everything, manage the building, make the tea, and set the standards for storage and apply them, and worry about accredited service as well, which is how they sustain their kind of funding. So it's a real difficulty trying to see how you cope with all of these different formats and conditions. We have the same problem in a very big organization like the National Archives, that we've inherited papers from different departments, which tend to be well looked after, but they have been used as working documents, and they are often, in terrible condition if they've been very well used, and the tags are all ripping the papers. And our collection care people have got a massive backlog of remedial work just to make things robust enough to be produced in the room. And we've got a massive problem with mold as well. Literally toxic mold. Yeah. So I hear what you're saying about this range of difficulties, and often a one digitization exercise in many ways can save those records from future use and abuse and handling, because I'm sure our collection care staff would rather we didn't handle anything, because every time you open a ledger, you leave leather dust and fragments on the table. and it needs five readers to do that in a year, and practically the binding will come off because the chances are no one's used that document for 30 years if it's in a series where no research has kind of come across the subject. So we don't necessarily find these problems until we're alerted to them, because a big collection, there's plenty of space for people to move around and miss these things, and not everything gets reported, and we quite often can't see immediately where the problem was. I mean, that's why we've got a good audit trail of who is using what materials, not necessarily to track sort of potential theft and damage, but basically so we can see how popular material is potentially being degraded just by handling and use.
Yeah.
So,
but I was because if you talk about digitalization and digital access to records, we're obviously in a very fortunate position that we are a national organisation and we are actually an independent research organisation as well. So it's a slightly false picture compared to smaller archives. We've got a big digital research team, we've got digital preservation teams, we've got people working in liaison with government about transferring big digital data at the moment. But we're also experimenting with things like handwritten text recognition, natural language processing on the material in our collection, so that if we do a digitalization project, it's not simply images, it's actually the metadata behind it as well that we can produce. Most county record offices and smaller archives won't have a team who can do that. They won't necessarily have an individual on the staff who's knowledgeable enough to do that, and they won't necessarily have the agreements in place with their depositors to allow digitalization of collections. Because obviously in the locals, everything we have is created by government. We have to make it accessible under the open government license. But in local record offices, many collections are guided by a deposit agreement, often drafted decades ago, which doesn't take into account changes in modern access. But of course, the deposit agreement has to be maintained. That's why I think a lot of archives, when they take things in, like to have them by gift, not by deposit, so that they're then free to be able to do whatever they want, whatever researchers want. You often find, that's why a lot of sometimes when you go to an archive, you're not allowed to photograph something. It's not because the collection, a conservation matter. It's because of an agreement that's in place with the owner of that particular archive.
we're also working under a Public Record Act from the late 1950s, which doesn't mention digital at all because it didn't exist. So the whole landscape for access and conversion is so different that we're having to think about, how that would work legally going forwards, because until fairly recently, a lot of the digitization of the big record set like the census or military service papers, where there's millions of elements to be digitized, we can't even contemplate doing that in-house. So it has to be done with a commercial partner, and they'll create the metadata and the search, but then it pops behind a firewall and it's restricted.
Yeah.
So technology is allowing, and what a lot of the VRTI project is doing is really testing some of these technologies about conversion and data capturing.
Yeah, linking data.
Exactly. So that's bringing it back into sort of more ambitious and smaller scale operations, not just the big census. I mean, the 1931 census, 21 census in Ireland.
Yeah, it's going to come out next year, isn't it? 26.
That's a good case for how a lot of the technology developed beyond 2022 and 19 and the virtual record treasury will be applied to a big kind of social opportunity to look at the cutting edge of digitalization in a way that everybody will be aware of, because a lot of people will be wanting to look at that. So it's really interesting, but it's also really problematic because we are at a big crossroads where technology is suddenly available. We've talked about automatic character recognition for years, especially then converting languages into English or other languages. So Google Translate is doing a better job at that, and then there's other versions of that kind of software which can handle Latin abbreviations in documents and deal with accounting notes in margins and things like that. So the chamber books had to, although it was an XML kind of project, converting it that way, we had to devise ways to convert accounting notes and abbreviations in the margins for payments and schedules for bonds and things like this. And it kind of worked. It was a bit manual. It was a bit of a squeeze at times, but that was now 8 years ago. So technology is.
But you were working with a big digital humanities institute.
Yeah, it was DHI at Sheffield were doing that for us. So in a way, they were applying all of their cutting edge ideas to it, and it was still struggling to some extent with 5,000 pages of information, never mind 30 million military service papers, that kind of thing. So it's fascinating to sort of hear how you know approaching the South Africa company records just because of the similar problems we experience trying to think about that kind of process, but often on a bigger scale because of the government material we're getting.
I've been doing some stuff looking at the Russian American company, so it's all in old Russian. And what we've been doing is putting it into the paid version of ChatGPT, so the best version of that. Then we get a translation into modern Russian, and from the accounts this is, and then we get a translation from that into English, and then I'm working with co-authors who are Russian, so then they can just double check. So that has been very successful. But sometimes it's not always, particularly for small archives, it's not just about the digitization either. I mean, for the TNA, I guess you're always going to be there and you can support going forward something that's digitized, but small record offices are not necessarily going to have the funding to support, once they've digitized something, to support it and make it accessible. And as you say, that's where paywalls come in and make it less accessible, in fact, perhaps. Does anybody have any comments on any? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this opportunity to thank our presenters very, very much for a really interesting session. Thank you to Paul and Sean and Neve and to Sean. A fabulous, nice, lovely mix of different approaches to the ideas of archives. And I'm going to ask Darren if he could switch off the recording. And then if people want to stay for a further chat, they're more than welcome. But I appreciate